Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Irene Monastrolo from the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I have the great pleasure today to introduce and moderate the first research policy session on how could financial institutions and policymakers assess climate-related financial risk, and in particular transition risk in investors' portfolio. Today with me, I have the pleasure to have four speakers, both from academia and financial supervisors and policymakers. The characteristics of these speakers is that they either contributed to foster academic knowledge and research on climate economics and sustainable finance, and to apply the research to financial supervision and policy making. Just before I leave the floor to the panelists and introduce them, I would like to discuss with you and introduce you to the issues at stake that we face when we talk about the relation between climate change and financial stability. So we know that achieving the Paris Agreement climate targets requires to align investment to sustainability. At the same time, we know that recent research show, we will present tomorrow our just published papers, that financial markets are not reacting enough. This means that yes, there is a slight reaction on the green side, but actually they are not pricing yet the risk of staying brown, and this means, implies that there could be a mispricing of climate risk. Thus, policies have been advocated to signal the market, such as carbon tax, and even further, there are advocates of green monetary policies and financial regulations, but yet governments are delaying the introduction of climate policies. In this context, a disorderly transition can trigger financial risk. And indeed, Mark Carney, Governor of Bank of England, and other central bankers started to talk about climate Minsky moments. There is a main gap for investors and financial supervisors and policymakers to assess and embed climate risk in financial valuation, which is the lack of standardized and transparent science-based metrics and methods. This is crucial to inform both investors' portfolios risk management strategies in the low carbon transition, but also financial supervisors with a financial stability mandate on delivering on their mandate, and in particular to understand to what extent climate change could represent a risk for financial stability. There is growing awareness indeed of climate-related financial risk by central banks and financial supervisors. We already mentioned Mark Carney, but this year at the annual IMF World Bank annual meeting, the new managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, actually openly spoke about the need to gear up for the IMF to integrate climate risk in its surveillance duty. And we even, I was so glad to be invited as a panelist in a session talking about what the IMF could do to mitigate climate Minsky moments. Should they worry? Yes. We see here the results of the climate stress test of the financial system that we published 2 years ago with Stefano Battistone and Antoine Mandel and other colleagues on nature climate change. Stefano will talk more later about this. However, what we show is that investors' exposure to climate, forward-looking climate transition risk is significant and could be amplified by network effects. Why is it difficult and challenging for investors and financial supervisors to address such risk? Well, this is due to the nature of climate risk, which is characterized by nonlinearity, endogeneity, and complexity, and also by the nature of financial risk that is characterized by, which is driven by financial interconnectedness. Also, it's difficult because there is a bit of misunderstanding of what we are talking about when we talk about climate risk. And in particular, in this case, it's important to highlight that climate ESG, is environmental social governance, is different type of risk from climate risk. In order to fill this gap, research has been developing in the recent years standardized, transparent, science-based climate financial risk metrics and methods, such as climate value at risk, the climate spread, and the climate stress test, to help investors and financial supervisors to bridge the gap. And today we will be actually presenting this research and showing the applications in collaboration with climate scientists and climate economists. Indeed, today we have here as panelist Kiwan Riai, who is the director of the energy program at IIASA and lead author of the IPCC report. So Kiwan will discuss how integrated assessment model have contributed to inform climate science and the policy discussions, and what are the opportunities and challenges to use the output to inform climate financial risk metrics and methods. Professor Stefano Battistone from the University of Zurich will talk about the framework that we co-developed to use the scenarios and trajectories of the integrated assessment models to develop climate financial risk metrics and climate stress test. Then we will have Petri Jakubik, who is a team leader of Financial Stability Department of the European Insurance and Occupational Pension Fund Authority in Frankfurt, who will present the result of a joint collaboration. It's a climate risk assessment of the sovereign bonds portfolio of insurance companies in Europe, which was recently published as a Financial Stability Report of EIOPA. And Lucia Alessi, who is a project leader at the European Commission Joint Research Center in Ispra. She was deeply involved in the work of the European Commission Green Taxonomy, and together with Stefano and Alan Roncoroni, they jointly developed a financial risk assessment of the Green Taxonomy used the methodologies co-developed by Stefano. So I leave the floor to the speakers. I will be really sharp in keeping the time. So you have 9 to 10 minutes. Then we will have a short round discussion with all of you and clarifications. And then I will open the floor for questions and answers. Kiwan, the floor is yours. Yeah. So actually, while we wait to fix the technical problems, I just would like to tell you also why we are all here today together. So it started all 4 years ago, where together with Stefano, and I was still at Boston University, we decided to use the trajectories produced by integrated assessment models to assess the potential paths that an economy could take in order to achieve the climate targets of the Paris Agreement. Our idea was to say, okay, what is the financial risk or financial opportunities associated to staying on one trajectory or to another trajectory? And in particular, this is the work that we jointly developed recently. The point was, to what extent and under which conditions finance could be a driver or a barrier to achieve the climate targets. And this is something that we have been, when Mark before talking about interdisciplinarity, it's easy now to talk about interdisciplinarity or even transdisciplinarity in research projects, but 4 years ago it was a bit challenging, and even today, in putting it into practice. I think we can go now?
Yeah, it works now. Great. Yeah, thank you a lot, Irene, for the kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here even twice on a day. So I want to perhaps use my 10 minutes to talk a little bit about the challenge of integrating finance into the traditional way that climate mitigation analysis is done. I think recognizing, and those of you who have been in the morning will recognize this slide, recognizing that the pledges from the Paris Agreement and the current political process is moving towards a completely different direction than what is needed for limiting warming to 2 degrees. For those who haven't been in the morning here, the red emissions pathway here are those which are suggested by the pledges of different countries in the post-Paris process, and the green and the blue areas or pathways down there, these are those pathways that are consistent with the long-term objective of the Paris Agreement to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees and try to achieve even 1.5 degrees. In order to close this gap, and I mentioned that already in the morning, it is necessary to fundamentally change the way that we invest into the energy system particularly. What you can see here is our average investments between now and 2050. On the right-hand side, you can see the massive upscaling needs in terms of investments into critical options like efficiency, renewables, but also into energy infrastructure for transmission and distribution and storage. And at the same time, we need to disinvest into fossil fuel sectors. So we need to massively reduce investments into fossil power systems as well as into the fossil extraction industry. And those changes in the investment portfolio would need to occur in order to really bend the curve from emissions down to what they have seen before. So this is a typical investment portfolio for a 1.5 degree scenario. And I think finance can here a very important role in mobilizing those investments. There are different studies out there who started to interpret scenarios that come out from the climate science community in terms of the financial risks. This is one study, and very early pioneering study done by UNEP, who looked into different risk factor pathways on a very aggregated level. I want to emphasize another study that I've shown in the morning already. Which a slide that has been shown now 5 times today, and I think it's a slide that deserves to be shown 5 times. So that's really, I would say, the pioneering study that is out there at the moment, trying to evaluate financial risks in terms of what's the value at risk and in terms of stress testing. But I think we are really at the moment relatively far away. The two scientific communities start to talk to each other, but it's by far not yet, I would say, something that we want to perhaps even mainstream, that finance experts and finance scientists work together with climate scientists in the future. And in order to achieve this, and I announced this already in the morning, there's a new community effort underway from the integrated assessment modeling community, where the main experts from the climate science side have formed a task force, or a scientific working group to engage with the finance community, with people like Stefano and Irene and other colleagues. And there are a number of challenges when we think about how to bridge climate science and to assess finance implications. One is particularly that I think the information that we need in terms of finance risks is very heterogeneous. So there is not one monolithic finance community out there, but banks, insurers, reinsurers, institutional investors, the industry sector, multinational corporation, all need different types of information in order to be able to assess financial risks at different levels. And a lot of that information is actually not available from the climate scenarios. So the climate scenarios are available at a relatively aggregated level, and they need to be translated and expanded in terms of granularity so that we can more directly look into financial risk implications of those transition sciences. I think another big challenge in this handshake of the two communities is that climate scientists, and particularly long-term mitigation pathways, focus on different time frames than the finance community. So if you look at climate scenarios, there's a lot of inertia in the climate system. Fundamental changes to socioeconomic systems require also times. So usually the time scale that we are interested in, these are decades up even to a century. While if you think about financial risks or finance risks, you think usually 6 months ahead, or perhaps 10 years ahead. 10 years is probably long term, 6 months is a short term. Correct me if I'm wrong. So in order to think about a role model of how to bring the two communities together, there was actually some initial thinking and discussion that the computer system doesn't like Austrians, it seems. Okay, so in order to, this is now animated, it makes it, okay. So in order to bring the two communities together from the analytical side, there is some initial discussion ongoing, and this is a summary figure actually from a paper that Stefano, Irene, Bas van Reuven from EASA and myself have just recently submitted, and which tries to sketch a way how we can better integrate climate mitigation information with information from the science side. I think first step here, we need to develop narratives of how future financial systems will operate, narratives which are consistent with the narratives that we develop in the climate mitigation area. Usually, first of all, there needs to be a qualitative story about what changes we need. This is a really nice animation which doesn't work here. Yeah?
You want to go back?
No, I want to also go.
There's a delay.
Okay. Just
Delay
one.
of 5
Okay,
seconds.
okay. But perhaps let's do it without animation. So the second steps would be to look into climate scenarios, into existing scenarios, try to understand in which sectors, which areas, or which time frames we can see specific shocks, and try to translate them in terms of, let's say, strong changes in market shares, and Stefano was alluding towards this before. Then after that, this is on the right upper side, I think one could do some finance climate valuation of the scenarios and of the different options, including the stress testing. And ultimately, what you want to do is you want to look at the one hand, understand risks that might exist because of the transition, but you want also to assess opportunities that might come from the finance sector and think about finance instruments that might support mobilization of investments and feed those instruments endogenously back into the scenarios so that we get a better understanding also of the pace of change in climate mitigation scenarios. Yeah, with that, I want to finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and this I think give an assist to Stefano's presentation, because Stefano will actually build on what Kiwan presented so far in terms of climate, the use of integrated assessment, the development of integrated assessment models and their use for financial valuation, and Stefano will actually discuss and present what we did in the last 4 years, with in particular an application that we did when I was last summer in Stanford University, and it's a joint work with the Austrian National Bank that provide data on its sovereign bonds portfolio.
Okay, so now what I will be very briefly talking about is how to essentially fill the gap between this guy and this guy. So they represent the knowledge in climate science and in climate economics and all the pathways, energy pathways, feasible energy pathways that we've been talking about. And now, however, eventually we need to reach those who are supervising the insurance and the other parts of the financial sectors, and of course, and then Petr will say what are the needs, but I will try to explain very quickly how to go from one side to the next. And the first important concept is something that we touched upon this morning, is the fact that the energy transition could be disorderly. And by disorderly, and it's not actually a term that we have invented, it's a term that has emerged in the community of practice. What people mean by that, in particular the Network for Greening the Financial System, a disorderly transition is a transition in which there would be large changes in asset prices that are not anticipated or not fully anticipated by the market participants. And in particular, this could be leading to larger asset price volatility that is not then taken into account. And if the portion of the assets that are concerned is large, you could even have systemic risk. So now, why is that important? Because, as we also said this morning, one of the key features of climate-related financial risk is that it is a new type of risk for finance. It has features that are very different from the type of risk that you would typically consider and look at in finance. Typically, the way you define a price in finance, that you assume that you have a distribution of returns, for instance, a distribution that is known by the agents ex ante, and then you can take an expectation on that distribution, and this is a distribution that you can calibrate based on using historical data. These are all things that simply do not apply in the case of climate. There is the endogeneity, and there is the tail, there is the multiple equilibria, and completely different notion of discount rate that is appropriate. That means that essentially traditional approaches need to be inadequate and needs to be complemented. And so what we have been developing, thanks to the vision of Irene, who was first working in a group that actually was developing, one of the main group that is developing the integrated assessment models, the vision to fill the gap between the work that is done by the whole community on integrated assessment models and the world of finance. And but in addition to that, because we're scientists and we're academics, we think, and it is really important, that this has to be done with a scientific approach. And that's what we've been developing. So we have a framework that is transparent. It's very important that it's transparent because it makes it replicable. And here you see there in the third bullet is a list of some of the partners that are involved in this endeavor, in particular the Vienna University of Economics and Business and Paris School of Economics. And just to, now there is a little bit of overlap with what I've been talking this morning, which was supposed to be an academic session, but then, you know, I was a crowd of practitioners showing up, so that we were very glad of seeing. But so there was a little bit of overlap in the slides, but that's, I think, is actually useful. So in a nutshell, what our framework does is the following: provide a rationale, a rational approach to understand what is the information set that an investor or an agent in the model, if you want, would need to look at in order to codify the available information, the available knowledge, both about climate science and about the feasible transition pathways. And then you want to implement that into a risk management strategy that has to cope with a very deep challenge, which is risk management. You want to be quantitative, but at the same time, you want to recognize, acknowledge, and do something about the deep uncertainty that, as we heard this morning, characterizes anything about climate change and any remedy that it will be carried out. And so eventually, the output is an adjustment of risk metrics that are otherwise familiar to in finance. And so what is very important is that we carry that out in an illustration, an example that makes sense to people. And one of the examples that makes a lot of sense to people is a portfolio of either corporate bonds or sovereign bonds. And that's exactly what we are doing in this exercise with the EIOPA. We are demonstrating how you can do it. And then, of course, there's a lot of caveats that should be taken with the results, but this shows what is the analytics and what is the channel. Now, I will very quickly go through what is the chain of, let's say, the various modules of this framework. So without repeating too much, getting into the details. There is a module that looks into the climate scenario that feeds into the module that extract from that the shocks from the trajectories. From there, you need to get down to either the asset level, so to say, so either the characteristics of the firm or the characteristics of the issuer, which can also be a country. And then, once you've done that, you can derive then once you have a statistics, well, you derive all the risk metric you want and all the familiar one. The problem is to find a reasonable way to shift them. So this was also the formal representation of the information set. I think it's just for you to know that there is a way in which you can formalize and say what are the items that you should have there. This is how many minutes do I have? 0, negative. I mean, 4. Okay, good. So when I said that you can and you should, but it's difficult to reconcile quantitative measurement with the deep uncertainty, that's the way we think about it. This is an example in this formula, climate value at risk strategy. Essentially what you need to do is consider the various policy shocks that are possible for the, in case the transition is not orderly, is disorderly. If the transition is orderly, nothing happens, so we shouldn't worry. But there are many people are reasonably concerned that the scenario of a disorderly transition is non-negligible in probability. We don't know how much, but it's non-negligible. And then still, it can happen in many different ways. So you need to condition to the various policy shock. Let's call them policy shock. I can expand a bit more later. And then you want to see, condition to that, what would be the value at risk that I can compute in that scenario? And then I need a decision rule on how to do that. And then it depends on how risk averse I am, which kind of institution I am, and so on. I think it's probably, just maybe wanna give you a sense of the, just this, and then I'll pass the floor. Essentially, what the channel of transmission that we are looking at is the following. It's highlighted in this formula. So delta Q is a change in probability of default of the issuer J when going from a business as usual B to a policy scenario P. So we call this the P shock. So it's a climate policy shock P. And condition to that shock, essentially what you model after you have done some algebra, you can derive a formula where you can see that the probability of default of the issuer, be it a firm or a sovereign, essentially is shifted by a combination of shocks that have to do with the revenue stream in different sectors that are relevant for the transition. And then in particular the fossil sector, and then the renewable sector and the fossil sector, both in primary and secondary energy. Okay, so I think that's the... Yeah, so maybe something that it's worth mentioning, thanks to the connection of Irene to the Austrian National Bank. 2 years ago, we started a collaboration with them. Actually, the whole story behind this sovereign bond is that the Austrian National Bank was asking us to carry out an assessment of sovereign, of their portfolio. And then when we looked into their portfolio, it turned out that 80% was exposed on sovereign bonds. So then basically we had to come up with a fresh idea on how to carry out an assessment of climate risk for sovereign. And that's how things then developed, and we started thinking about a sovereign as a portfolio of activities through the composition of the gross value added. I think it's maybe a good time to, sorry, this is a few seconds delay, so you have to synchronize your mind with, no, this is, I think, Alan? Oh, okay. You thought I was using the remote control, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, Stefano. And now we pass the floor to Petr Jakubik from European Insurance and Occupational Pension Fund Authority. We present our joint collaboration and why doing a climate financial risk assessment is important for EIOPA and for insurance companies, and what are the challenges in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. And also, first of all, I would like to thank to all organizers, and especially Stefano and Irene, for inviting me. It's overall a very useful conference, I can see. There's a bit of echo. I don't know. Is it better now? I think it's that micro. If someone could... This micro is on. Okay. Maybe now, yeah, now it's better. Okay. So very much thanks, and I think it's very useful conference and talk. Also, for me personally, as apart from my work in EIOPA, I'm also as a hobby affiliated at university, and I'm very close to academic work. So it's very close to my heart to see this bridge and cooperation. So I'm very happy to be here, and I will try to address the issue which was mentioned. I can build up on many things which were mentioned already. And in EIOPA, I would say first why we are looking at this, why it's important to assessing and pricing climate risk. And that's something what I also have to see personally. It's my mindset also completely changed, because like 2 years ago, we were not really having this in our agenda. I didn't have it in my own mind. And it really changed dramatically over last year. And apart from the traditional risk, which as an institution which is responsible for insurance sector and pension funds, we can basically for us key risks are of course financial risk, but these new emerging risks are getting more and more important, apart from cyber risk, which was also present when we started the session, kind of. So we have now climate risk. So that's something very new, and it's getting a lot of attention indeed. Now, why it's important? It was also mentioned that we have different type of investors. So insurance are long-term investors. So we were mentioning before the horizon 6 months. Okay, that's not the horizon insurance is supposed to look at, yeah? Because they are having, especially life insurance, they are having liabilities, let's say 20, 30 years, sometimes even more. And they somehow need to match the risk. So indeed, they are affected by long-term risk. And climate risk is one of them which they could be affected with. And for this reason, it's very important that insurance are incorporating climate change risk in their own risk management. And of course, for us, as we are kind of supervisor of supervisors, it's important that we also understand this risk, and we also steer national supervisors and finally, ultimately, the industry to bring this in their mindset. EIOPA did already some work in this respect, so there were several initiatives. There was first analysis, which actually was mentioned today by Stefano. That was the analysis on potential climate sensitive exposure based on the work which Stefano did. Just looking at the different sector exposure to different sectors and to do kind of rough estimate what might be the magnitude of the exposure of insurance toward the climate risk. Of course, this is very rough, so further works needed to follow. EIOPA also issued the opinion on integrating sustainability and climate change risk into the Solvency II framework, so that also came out relatively recently, September 2019. We are also planning to do sensitivity analysis this year. And ultimately, we also want to implement this or include this in our stress testing methodologies when stressing insurance sector at the European level. So indeed, this topic is important. And this was also reflected by a recently revised, actually it's very fresh, EUPA regulation, which we had this ESAS review, this free European agency regulation were revised, and also EUPA regulation was revised, and sustainability finance is pronounced quite explicitly in the regulation. So we also supposed to do this based on the mandate. Now, why we need cooperation with academia? Because we are a relatively small institution, so just for your background, because I don't know how many of you are familiar with our setup, we are around 150, 160 people, but we are working a lot with national supervisors, so it's in fact more because we are getting a lot of inputs from them. But in any case, our capacity is somehow very limited, and we need to leverage on the work which is done outside the institution, and especially in academia. In this respect, there was this publication which Irene mentioned in a recent financial stability report. It was published just before Christmas. It was a small Christmas gift for us because there was also thematic article section when the article, which was joint article actually with 3 of the panelists and 2 of panelists and 1 moderator. So basically, almost all authors are now here. So we published jointly this paper in the report, which was assessing climate risk for sovereign government bonds for the European insurance sector. And definitely there is further cooperation is planned, is needed. And let me just say a few words why sovereign. So this is the setup for European insurance. So what is the investment splits for European insurance? And you see that sovereign is one of the most important. And also it was the area where, let's say, the expertise was somehow limited. So that's why we focus on this. And as I have a very short time to finish, why sovereign bonds portfolio insurance, why this is kind of challenging also for the industry. It is because we have somehow limited knowledge of this, because it's a kind of, it was mentioned already in the morning, it's you need to have forward-looking approach, you cannot base it on historical data and so on. So that's why it's somehow challenging. And there are some results from our paper which show that the exposure among the country is somehow quite heterogeneous. Despite on scope, seems to be very limited. Depends what kind of scenario, of course, we apply. So if we apply some severe scenario, it might be more materialized, but you also need to keep in mind that sovereign exposures are kind of quite high in terms of overall setup of the portfolio. So we will continue this work, and I want also to mention one initiative which was actually recently launched, and that's EUPA call for research proposals, which we launched somewhere end of October, beginning of November on our website. Actually, the deadline was yesterday, so we received some proposal for research paper. It's a kind of framework. We are setting up the framework for a cooperation with external researchers, to have some rules and to have more work and leverage on this, and to set up kind of project to allow also external researchers to work on our data together with us and to leverage on this. And of course, climate risk is one of the potential topics. So I will stop here to keep also some time for chair. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I will try and use this one. So good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I'm here to speak about the EU taxonomy of sustainable activities and the research support that we provided in the context of the development of this piece of regulation. So what is the EU taxonomy? I don't know if... I can go back? Okay.
You have to press gently and wait 3 seconds.
All right. Okay, so what is the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy? It is basically a list of economic activities with performance criteria in terms of metrics and thresholds for their contribution to 6 environmental objectives that are listed in the slide. The taxonomy at the moment focuses on climate and in particular on climate change mitigation and adaptation. So an economic activity, I will probably use. An economic activity is defined as green if it does provide a substantial contribution to at least one of the objectives, and at the same time does no significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives, and it complies with some minimum social safeguards. Economic activities may be, energy production, but also cement production or steel production or land transport. So they are defined quite granularly. Why do we needed a taxonomy? We needed a taxonomy essentially to bring clarity to the market, so that investors have certainty about the greenness of the investment they're going to make, so that their decision process is smoother, easier, they save time and money. And also regulators and policymakers can use the taxonomy. In fact, the taxonomy is the cornerstone of the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which includes many other key actions, but many of them, also many pieces of regulation will refer to the taxonomy. For example, the eco-label, the regulation on the ESG disclosures, the development of an EU green bond standard, they all refer to the taxonomy as an underlying dictionary. So what is the taxonomy? As I said, it is a list of economic activities and relevant criteria. It is by any means not a rating of good or bad companies. It is not at the level of the company, it's at the level of the economic activity. It is very flexible to adapt to different investment styles and strategies, and is, of course, no mandatory list to invest in. It's simply a reference. As I said, is very heavily science-based, and it's absolutely not making any judgment on the financial performance of an investment. It only looks at the environmental performance of an economic activity. And finally, as I said, it will continue to be developed to cover also the other 4 environmental objectives, and it will respond to changes in technology, science, and new activities and data. This is an overview, a very high-level overview of the sectors that are covered in the taxonomy. The structure of the taxonomy follows the NACE classification, which is the standard statistical classification for economic activities in Europe. 67 activities are included in the taxonomy. So for each of these activities, the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, with the help of the Joint Research Center, has developed metrics and thresholds in terms of energy efficiency or greenhouse gas emissions. How can one use the taxonomy, for example, to assess the greenness of an investment? So let's take the example of an equity portfolio. One would start at the level of each investee company, look at the business mix, check what's the proportion of the company revenue or turnover or capex, which is taxonomy compliant, and then average for the whole portfolio. Now, this is, of course, much easier said than done. First of all, because there is no suitable data. Second of all, because you do not have direct control on the money that is raised by equities. So there are many challenges. However, this is a job that needs to be done. It's a dirty job, but someone has to do it. And I'm quite proud to say that together with Stefano, Alan, and Sofia from the ECB, we have actually done it. We have developed a financial impact assessment of the EU sustainability taxonomy, try and understand where European financial markets stand with respect to environmental sustainability and what could be plausible scenarios going forward. So, I'm waiting. Okay. Thanks to the European Central Bank, who shared confidential data on investors' exposures, the first thing that we did was to classify investors' holdings into climate policy relevant sectors, which are the sectors of the economy where climate-related risks and opportunities are building. And we provide in the report, which is published and available online, we provide some interesting charts at the level of the, for investors aggregated at the level of institutional sectors. So we can do that for equities and bonds. I'm waiting, okay, bonds. Another thing that we did was to check the holdings of European investors against the taxonomy. So in this chart, we plot a taxonomy considered holdings. So the holdings that for which the taxonomy provides a threshold, a criterion. So the light green part of the bar that you see there is not necessarily whole taxonomy compliant. It's simply considered in the taxonomy. And you can see that it's already quite minor, in fact. So you can imagine that taxonomy eligible investments will be even smaller than the light green part. And as I said, we do this for equity portfolios and for bond portfolios. Then another thing that we do is to estimate the taxonomy eligible market share. So in this case, we really try quite heroically, but indeed we are the first ones to try and do that. We try to estimate what is the share of European bond and equity markets that at this very same moment could be taxonomy compliant. And we do, I mean, there is a lot of work behind this because this is based on security by security data, and it's based on each and every criterion that the taxonomy puts forward for each and every economic activity. So for manufacturing, buildings, transport, each and every subsector of these. So based on a careful analysis of the criteria and on the data that we have on the structure of European equity and bond markets, these are the numbers that we come up with. And of course, I can't discuss the results, but this is just to motivate you to go and read the report. And finally, what we do is a projection of what we could expect going forward. This projection basically tells you the increase in financial investment that we might possibly see in the various climate policy relevant sectors. We also include bonds and loans as relevant financing sources for this additional green investment that we need. The underlying macroeconomic scenarios on which these numbers are based are provided by the literature and are the ones that are published by the European Commission, for example. And our overall conclusion is that these numbers are definitely within reach. So it's not like a more enormous amount of investment that we need to meet the targets.
Thank you so much, Lucia. And the reason why I wanted Lucia to be the last one to present the research is because of course, the taxonomy represented a big step in the Sustainable Finance Action Plan of the European Commission, but also attracted a lot of discussion. And, but in particular, it represented the first tool that investors could use to understand at least what could be classified as green or climate, aligned to climate mitigation, less to adaptation, and also not to do harm. And based on this, I would like to open shortly the discussion among our speakers. So I would like you to take one point that you found particularly interesting about in the presentation of your colleagues, and then I will open the floor for questions and answers. So, who want to start?
May I pick a challenging question for us and also for the audience? I think, so some people may start thinking, okay, what is the relation between the taxonomy and the first part of the presentation, which was the discussion, which was on an assessment of risk. And so there are things that can be said, things cannot be said too much, but about what is behind, behind the curtains of the taxonomy. But of course, it is clear that the vision is that you cannot do any assessment of climate-related risk, in particular related to the transition, if you don't introduce first some level of classification of the economic activities. And maybe I would like to Lucia to comment on that.
I'll try to use this one. Yeah, I know where you're heading to, because I know you would very much like to have a brown taxonomy, like many others. And the only thing that
what we wanted to hear from you.
Of course, I know what you want to hear from me, but I mean, the only thing that I can say is that you always need to keep in mind that the political process behind each and every small advancement is very, very difficult and cumbersome. So it was already, negotiations behind the green taxonomy have been successful. They have been long and painful. You can imagine how negotiations about the brown taxonomy would be. So let's be happy for the moment we have a green taxonomy, but then of course your point is taken with respect to risk analysis. A brown taxonomy would be useful.
And we are happy.
And maybe I would like to ask Keiwan, your models have a detailed representation of energy technologies and emission paths. So how do you feel in relation with the taxonomy, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, with the applicability of your models in the exercises provided by financial supervisors? And in particular, in this case, it was insurance, which have a particular business model and exposure to climate risk.
I can do probably this is enough. Yeah. I think this is a quite pertinent question. So, I mean, first of all, I think it would be interesting to try to use the taxonomy to evaluate also existing scenarios that are out there by the integrated assessment community. And but how I would do that, I'm actually not completely clear about this. You two need to tell me how to do this, actually. Yeah, it would help to connect the scenarios to what is happening, I think, more on the ground. I think it's a very promising research agenda, basically.
Very quickly, I think so for people who are not familiar with the data analysis or at the firm level or the sector level, this may seem a bit abstract, but in fact it's a very concrete problem. And so on the one hand, all these integrated assessment models are modeling in a very detailed way the economy, and in particular the energy sector, and in some cases also the transportation sector or the agricultural sector. And of course that use classifications. And then on the other side, we have very advanced and actually now implemented and approved very recently taxonomy, which of course is building also on another classification of economic activities, which, however, historically had a completely different purpose. That was the purpose of national accounts, which have been then enriched where it was possible with information about the technologies that are relevant for the transition. And this mapping is still in the making. That's exactly what Irene had the vision a few years ago to work on, and that's exactly what needs to be done more in detail. And once this is done, and you see the first fruits with this report we've done with the EIOPA, when this is done, and it will take years. I mean, we have to revise and go back, and this will provide will allow to carry out an assessment of risk that is better and better in terms of taking into account the various dimensions and making justice to the uncertainties that climate scientists tell us that we should take into account.
And maybe in this regard, Pet, you want to say something about,
Yeah.
as a financial supervisor, sorry, what we would like to see? I mean, what are the next steps that you foresee?
Yeah, so let me just complement. So definitely having taxonomy, it's great. So finally we have something that might be also used kind of cross-sectoral even, and it will be comparable. So we can also see what are the exposure across different sectors. I mean, we are very often in dialogue with also ESRB, so looking also at the banks, looking at with ESMA at financial markets, so we have kind of common language, that's good. What definitely needs to be done is to further work on the methodologies in terms of to move to include climate stress tests or climate stress test framework into our regular stress test framework, so to add this risk also into this, and that's something what we are currently working on, and that will still take some time because there are still many open questions, and it will overall help with assessing the risk. And but the first good starting point is to have the same language, and also to have the same language with the industry, with the companies, with the national supervisor, and in this respect, any kind of work which lead to having the common language, I could only welcome.
And I think that this is a very good, important point to close our first part of the session. And indeed, when we were talking before about the importance of interdisciplinarity and also the difficulty to making it happen, the main point was really trying to speak the same language in climate, among people who have very different backgrounds in climate science, climate economics. I'm an agricultural economist by background, actually, and also in people with a financial risk background. So now I would like to open the floor for questions, so we can collect, well, we are right on time, so we can collect several questions. Please go. Please raise higher hand. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, and 7. Perfect. Yeah, just a remark. When you do your question, please, it has to be a question, so only one question, and please introduce yourself. Thank you so much.
My name is Thomas Roth. My question is, as far as I've understood, the risk pricing only considers the revenue side. To what extent do you consider the cost side and indirect effects? The background of the question is that, for instance, with energy transition, I would expect substitution and displacement effects with potential price shocks on energy and transport in general. And as such, I would expect, for instance, a discount on any company activities that are relying on business models that are transport and energy intensive, even if they're fossil free.
Well, Axel Michaelova from Political Science, University of Zurich. To Stefano, you gave the two examples of two economic IAM models giving very different results in terms of the bond spread. Can you explain how there was a switch model giving a bond spread which was very different from the other bond spread in terms of the outcome, and it would be interesting to see what are the explanatory factors for these differences in the bond spreads.
Katharina Michaelova, equally University of Zurich Institute for Political Science. I can very much understand that the political process around this is very complex, and I was wondering whether an alternative to getting this pass onto the market would not let the supervisors start by applying something. So if you want to get through the Brown classification, for instance, I mean, couldn't that be an alternative?
So I think that these questions were mostly directed to Stefano, and then also K1 and Petr and also Lucia. So you can maybe start.
Maybe I take the easy one, and then so the easy question was the one about why the different models are giving, and then Q1 will explain more. So in the assessment, we used input from a selection of integrated assessment models, and there are differences in the assumptions and also differences in the calibration of these models, which interestingly lead to different trajectories in the future. And I'm sure Q1 can say more competent things about why. The result, however, is that because the trajectories, the scenarios of future trajectories of the various sectors in the economy can be quite different, then also the difference between the business as usual and the target, the scenario that is compatible with even the same climate policy, 450 pp in concentration, they imply a different economic shock. And because it's a different economic shock, everything else being the same, still the financial shock is different. There was the other question about the why only revenues and not cost. In fact, it's not entirely correct, but it's a very good point. Going forward, this is precisely one of the things that is being enriched, because luckily the interior assessment models provide also other variables, cost of resources that can be used in the input, and which then can update the not just the revenue side but also the cost side of the firms, and yeah, and this can be done under the different scenarios.
Perhaps coming back to the first question about the VICH and the GCAM, the two different results which look quite different. Actually, the uncertainty in terms of the price signals across different models is relatively large. And by using those two specific models, which are not, so these are not the models that I'm working with, one has a relatively good representation of the total economic spread. So the VICH model, we call it in the model jargon, is a relatively stiff model. So greenhouse gas reductions lead to relatively high price responses, while the GCAM model is relatively flexible in that regard. And they differ not only in terms of the modeling philosophy, a macroeconomic model compared to more a simulation model, but also in terms of the assumptions, how much transaction costs are there, how much optimality will be there in the climate policies themselves, which also make the price responsiveness of the different tools quite different. Perhaps one comment on the transport sector and the anticipated price shocks in the transport sector. Not all of the models foresee a price shock when transforming the transport sector. I think a critical factor here is to which extent we will also change values in the society, go away from the dominant current model of usership to ownership, to usership. So to which extent will in the future the quality of the service be in the focus, or who is actually owing the service? So it means, would you switch away from private car-based mobility to a more shared mobility if the shared mobility provides you with a better service? Because very often even a better service can be associated with a lower costs, and it depends a lot to which extent you can utilize the enormous leverage which is there because of the data sharing and also the digital revolution that we have, which can really economize transportation processes a lot. So it is not always a price signal it's not making, so a decarbonized system can be cheaper than a not decarbonized system. Depends on lock-ins and path dependency.
And maybe if I can add on this, it's also what we talk, when we talk about the low carbon transition, we mostly debate is about cost, but we forget, and this is something that we will discuss tomorrow in the session tomorrow morning in climate economics, that it's also a story of opportunities, and in particular of opportunities for actually fostering sustainable development and increase maybe the size of the pie in a just and sustainable way. So this is also something, and this does not always have to come at a cost and for someone. The policy applications, please.
I really like the question. In fact, I wanted to ask something very similar, whether supervisors can put any pressure on the market. Because like my personal idea is that there is something that supervisors can do. For example, when they design their stress test, they can make some assumptions, and then of course the message would pass to the market. However, if you look into the taxonomy, it is very, very detailed, and there was a lot of effort to decide on contentious matters, like, I don't know, gas, for example, or biofuels. You know, there are very many activities for which it's not as easy to say, you know, it's brown or it's not brown, and this is not for the supervisor. So this is something that ultimately will need to be regulated if other policies will need to rely on this definition, like, for example, bank capital requirements. You know, if a brown penalizing factor or a green supportive factor will be discussed, the definition of green and brown will need to be in the regulation.
Okay, so I got the last. No, I mean, I would just take it a bit maybe broader, not only from let's say, insurance supervision perspective. Maybe the mic. Might be better. Yeah, so there are two things which I would distinguish. So one is like, can supervisor kind of provide best practices in the way, which could be followed by the market and kind of steer the market, that market is using the best practices? And here the answer is yes. The another question is, what kind of rules should be implemented within the regulation? And now I'm talking about stuff like hard limits and, you know, this kind of issue. And that's different things. Then you need to have a taxonomy. So in terms of best practices, that's something what we are also doing as EIOPA. So as I mentioned before, that we are now working on basically providing stress testing methodology, having like a methodological paper, even saying what kind of practices can be used in a stress testing methodology, to have kind of toolkit or toolbox where, based on your aim and your setup, because all those things might be different, depends what is your aim, you know, which jurisdiction needs to cover which kind of risk, what do you want to check, what do you want to assess, and tend to pick up from this, you know, methodological toolbox the right part which would fit to you. But indeed, any work which is done in this field can further steer and help also the market to use the best practices and to be aware. The most important is that they need to be aware, and that's already part of EIOPA opinion, that they're supposed to reflect on this in their own risk assessment. So that's not something what we would not consider. That's exactly the direction we are going. Okay? Thank you.
So, thank you. We have still time for 3 short questions. So, what's next? It was, okay, 1, 2, and it was 3. Please introduce yourself and be short with the questions so that we have still time.
Now it's better. Annick Kohli from InRate. I have a question with regard to the EU taxonomy. You were saying or talking about the taxonomy compliance, and my question is, how do you, what does it mean, being compliant with the EU taxonomy, considering that there is a lot of data missing still, as you also showed on one of your slides? And how, what does it mean for the market once it is introduced? How can actors become compliant with the EU taxonomy?
Hello, good afternoon. Sorry. Good afternoon. My name is Victoria. My question is related as well with the EU taxonomy, similar to the prior question and relating the prior question with greenwashing and the possibility that taking into account that this is a pretty wide matter could open for greenwashing to come in. And as well, what was the criteria, the selection criteria in the analysis of equities and bonds? Is it indexes or market cap, or which was the criteria? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Monica Mechler, Zurich Insurance and former regulator. My question relates to identifying a climate value at risk. Now, in the financial crisis, we learned that these models, they oftentimes do provide insufficient information, particularly in a strong stress. Do you intend to combine this tool with a set of qualitative tools, which are, for example, helping to early warning indicators to be developed, or what are the learnings which you draw with a view to complementing such a measure as a climate value at risk?
Okay, for the speakers, we have brief 3 minutes each.
Super. Thank you very much for both questions on the taxonomy, because they allowed me to clarify a couple of crucial. So the first thing is that the taxonomy is not mandatory, so there is no obligation to become compliant with the taxonomy. It's simply a dictionary that tells investors or any market participants or any manufacturer or any economic agent whether an activity is green or not. So based on that, you can assess the greenness of your investment if you are an investor. Now, of course, there is no data yet at the level of the firm that tells you how much of the turnover of a firm is eligible or compliant. But this data will come. And on the second question, that refers to the analysis that we did together with Stefano and the co-authors. So basically, given that no data exists yet that is structured according to the taxonomy, we had to use what we have, which is the NACE classification. So for each security, we looked at the NACE code that is attached to that. And based on that, we did a classification of the portfolios. Then at the very aggregate level, in order to estimate the the bond market share that could be already taxonomy eligible, we basically use the criteria that are written in the taxonomy, which allow us to estimate what's the percentage of the market. Like, for example, if the criteria in the taxonomy prescribe that only the 10% of some manufacturing production is eligible, then we take the 10% of the equity and bond market as eligible. So this is the type of analysis that we did.
We want to address the question of greenwashing and then of the value at risk.
All right. So thank you for the question about value at risk, which allows me to clarify a bit. So value at risk is just one particular statistics that you can compute once you have distributions of returns, and the way but you can have many others, right? So value at risk is, we started from that. The reason is because value at risk has a regulatory use, and if you use the language, then people will pay attention to you. So it's very familiar to the market players. However, the value at risk that we compute is conditional to the climate policy shock scenario. So that means that you have as many value at risk as many scenarios you are willing to consider, and so what the conversation between scientists and practitioners, I hope, will get at to is to the identification of a finite set, but not zero measure. So something like between 4 and 6 scenarios that will be a faithful representation of the heterogeneity and the diversity of things that can happen, which are really potentially very different across the different scenarios, and then they can be used. So in that sense, they are kind of qualitative, because then since you don't necessarily have, or it's very difficult to have a reliable probability of each of the scenario, then you're asking, the supervisor will be asking the market players to say, tell me, how will you do, would you survive or not to this set of scenarios, even the more adverse, which is very similar to what happens in the stress test business, is exactly what the central bank is doing. The difference is that the scenarios and the metrics should not be just determined, identified, and developed by the finance community, in the finance practice and the supervisor. They should be co-designed with the academia, because otherwise we cannot be sure that those scenarios are severe enough, that those metrics are transparent enough, replicable, and we would end up in the risk of greenwashing, because then, of course, the short-term incentive of financial institutions is to claim that they are fine, they are not exposed to too much risk, because then they can lower the capital, right, requirement. So that's the game that you need to be careful. That's why we need objective scientific ground and the role of independent science that can vet and provide the scrutiny, the necessary scrutiny, because in the end, what we're talking about is a public safety issue. So we're not talking about just peanuts.
Any other remarks?
Maybe just one on this qualitative tools and assessment. I would just say, whatever field you are, it doesn't need to be climate change as a supervisor, so there is always space for a combination both. So that's a basic rule. So for whatever we do, we always combine quantitative and qualitative tools, and that's the usual suspect.
Okay. Anything else?
I would have, actually you said that was the last question, but I would have a question on the taxonomy myself. So a lot of the work that I'm doing recently is try to understand linkages that exist between introducing climate policies on the SDGs and other societal objectives as well. Now, I think this is, the taxonomy is great. Green and brown taxonomies, both are fantastic. However, in what you would like to do is, at the end, have some sort of taxonomy that takes, these multiple dimensions of sustainability into account, right? Climate is one objective among many, and whether you are invested in bonds or not, I think you need almost something like an SDG compatibility, or you need to broaden it. Was there any discussion when you did the taxonomy beyond climate and take into account major equity implications? There's social, environmental, and economic, right?
Yeah, very briefly. Hours and hours of discussion. In fact, this is called the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities. So sustainability does encompass also social and governance, the social and governance dimension. So you can expect that in the next or not so next future, at some point we'll get there. However, of course, we needed to start from somewhere, and we started from environment and in particular climate. It will be developed in the course of next years. However, it already takes into account minimum social safeguards. So, an activity cannot be defined green if it employs child labor.
Just maybe one thing to add, and that's kind of related. So, for the modeling part and the stress test methodology and all these things, like the importance or the reason why it's important to have it on top of the taxonomy is the fact that after this you are able to combine climate risk with other financial risk in a consistent manner. So if you would have a framework how to include climate risk into your stress testing framework, then you are able to combine with your financial risks, and that's, I see, a big benefit of it.
Thank you so much for this interesting discussion that will open the floor for, it's good food for us researchers, it's good food for thought for new papers as well, and also we hope to bring contribution with operational metrics and methods to policymakers and financial supervisors. Actually, the results of this session are pretty clear. There is need for a transparent assessment of climate-related financial risks and also opportunities in the economy and in particular in finance. We already started to develop in the academic community and the scientific community interdisciplinary metrics and methods. There is an opportunity to further apply them for policy work, but this requires further collaboration, and we look forward to continue the discussion with you. Two main points that emerged, one is greenwashing and the other is the need to be transparent and science-based in order also to avoid greenwashing. As we said before, climate-related financial risk requires interdisciplinary work, which means just plugging something labeled as green into a traditional financial risk pricing approach or economic model maybe will not, we are quite sure that it will not work, or it will lead to even more misleading results for recommendations to policymakers. So there is the need to be bright and bold in addressing and assessing climate-related financial risk. Thank you so much for your question, your participation. Let me thank again the four panelists and join me in thanking them.